Welcome to Linx. In this video, we're going to design and develop an API using Postman and Linx. Postman is an API collaboration platform that allows you to design and test your API along with the workflow around it. And Linx is a low-code development platform that allows you to develop your API and host it. Both platforms can be used to create and host your API documentation. In this video, we're going to be building a product API. The product API has two endpoints, one that returns all products in the database and another that returns a specific product for an ID that has been passed in. The API will receive the product data from an existing product database. Our workflow will be as follows. Add a pre-created OpenAPI 3 spec to a Postman workspace. Add tests in Postman. Then develop the API in Linx. While debugging the API in Linx, we'll also be simultaneously testing the API in Postman. After development is done, we'll deploy the API to a Linx server, which will host the live version of the API. We will finally test that live version with Postman. In Postman, we work in workspaces. I have pre-created a sandbox workspace for us to work in. Let's start off by going to APIs and then create a new API. I'm going to call this new API that we're creating Products, and the version I'm going to make 1.0.0, leave the schema type on OpenAPI 3 and the schema format on YAML. Now that an API has been created for us, we can go and define it. You'll see that Postman provides a template definition. However, we're going to remove this and paste in one that we have created. Once our definition has been pasted, we can save, and we'll see the endpoints for our API has now been populated. Notice how these operations are not yet available in the Collections or API tab. This is because we need to set up a test suite. This can be done by going to the Test tab and adding a new test suite. Let's call it Products API. And as soon as we've done that, the endpoints will become available for us to test and call. Notice how when I call this endpoint now, I receive an error as the API does not exist yet. We're now going to create the API in Linx. Let's start off by creating a new solution in Linx. This is the Linx Designer. The Linx Designer has multiple parts to it. Firstly, we'll look at the Solution Explorer. This is where we'll see all of our types, user-created functions, and services. Underneath the Solution Explorer, we have the Properties tab, where we will set the properties for various objects. In the middle, we have the central canvas, where we will build the functionality for our own created functions or events. On the right-hand side, we will find the Plugins tab. Here we have various plugins available in the form of components that we can drag into the central canvas to build our functionality. We can also add more plugins by clicking on the Add Plugin button. And on the bottom, we have the Validations tab. Here we'll see all warnings or errors that might occur. I'm going to start off by renaming my solution to Product API. Now that we've renamed the solution, I can start by adding in the REST plugin. This will allow us to host the REST service. After the plugin has been installed, let's drag the REST host onto the central canvas. This will now populate a REST host service for us. In the REST host service, there are two major properties that we need to set, the API definition and the base URI. For the API definition, let's use the same OpenAPI specification that we used in Postman. I'm going to paste that into the box. I'm also going to go up and copy the base URI that has been specified in the specification. We'll use this to populate the base URI field in the Properties tab. After we save the API definition, we can now see that two events have been populated for our API, the GetAllProducts event and the GetProductById event. We will later create the logic for these specific events. But for now, let's rename the API to Product API and debug it to see if we can call the API from Postman. To do this, select the REST host service and then click on Debug. The solution will now be built. After the solution has been built, we can click on Start. What this does is it creates a locally hosted version of the API for us to debug. In Postman, we can now go to the GetAllProducts endpoint and then call it. You'll notice that you'll get an internal server error. This is because no logic has been specified in the event yet. However, when we look on Linx, we can see that the service has been called. For further testing, we can set up automated test scripts in Postman. Let's do that now. In Postman, let's go to Test, and then in the allocated space, let's paste our JavaScript test. This test will check that there are more than 20 items returned in the product list. Note when calling the endpoint, the test will still fail due to an internal server error. However, we can see that the test has failed. Let's also add a test to the getProductById. This test will check that the product ID that is returned matches the one that was called. We will use these tests later. We can now return back to Linx to create the functionality of each event. Before moving forward, ensure that you save your solution. After saving the solution, we can now start by populating the functionality for each event. For the getAllProducts event, we will retrieve all products from the database and return that in the response body. This response will be in the format of a JSON object that is created for us by Linx. We can start by adding a database plugin. This plugin will allow us to interact with databases. After the database plugin has been installed, drag an execute SQL function onto the central canvas. The execute SQL function will allow us to interact with data in a database and has two major properties that we need to set: the connection string and the SQL script. For the connection string, this is something that we're going to use throughout our solution, so it would be best to make a setting for this. Think of a setting as a global variable that you can reuse throughout your solution. Create a setting, click on the settings icon, then give your setting a name, and then add in your connection string. Now that the setting has been created, we can simply select it from the drop-down menu. Now, after the connection string has been created, let's paste in our SQL script. We can also test the SQL script to ensure that it's working by going to the Test tab and clicking on the Execute SQL button. We also need to change the return options. We need to return all items in the product table. For us to do this, let's change the return option to List of Rows. Lastly, we need to set this return list to be the response body of this event. To do this, I'm going to use a SetValue function. The SetValue function allows us to set the value of a target object to something that we choose. Let's set the target to the result. And for the source, let's set the response to 100 to be our execute SQL function's output. Now that that's done, we've created the first event in our API. We can now test to see if everything is working fine by debugging the REST host again. Once debugging has started, I'm going to go back to Postman and test my endpoint once again. Now we see that once we call the endpoint, we receive values, and if I go to the test results, we can see that the test has passed. The next part of our development is to create the functionality for the getProductById event. This is going to be quite similar to what we did in the getAllProducts event, with the only difference being that this time we're going to filter for a specific ID. Let's drag in another execute SQL function, set the connection string, and paste the provided SQL script. This SQL script is different as it contains a parameter. This parameter can be seen on the right-hand side underneath Parameters. For your solution, you can add in any other parameter that you require. Let's test the script with ID1 to see that exactly one product is returned. Since we're only interested in one product, we can change the return option to be only the first row. Once again, we need to set the output of the event to be the output from the execute SQL function. Drag another SetValue function from the Plugins tab onto the central canvas. Set the target to be the result, and for the source, let's set the response to 100 to be the value from the execute SQL function. We've now created the functionality for our second event, and it's time to test again. In Postman, I'm going to change the parameter for product ID to 1, call the endpoint, and now we receive a response. And for the test results, we can see that this test also passed as the ID is the same as the path parameter. Now that we've created the functionality for our API, we can finally deploy it to a server where it will be hosted. Usually this is done by simply clicking on the deploy button and then deploying your solution to a server. However, if this is the first time that you're deploying to a Linx server, you will need to add the server onto the Linx designer. To do this, click on the Add Server button. Now enter your provided credentials for your Linx server. Once this is done, you can click on Deploy and Open Server. This will now deploy your solution to the server and then open the server in a new browser window. Once the browser window opens, you will need to log in with your details. Once logged in, we can see all of our solutions on our Linx server. I'm going to click on the Product API solution since I want to see more details on it. Here we can see our Product API service. However, it is still off. We need to turn it on in order to call it. Before moving forward, there is one more thing that we need to do. We need to update the base URI to now reflect that of our server. To do this, go to the Linx designer, then for the base URI property, let's change this to be plus, which is a wildcard for the server's address, and set the port to be 8080. Also change the HTTP to be HTTPS. Once that's done, we also want to ensure that we will be able to host documentation. From the API documentation dropdown, select Swagger UI. Now let's save our solution and redeploy it with these new settings. Once the solution is successfully deployed, we can turn the API service on. This will now allow us to interact with the API. On the Linx server, to interact with the API, we need to use its URI. That URI is servername.api.linx.2057.net. And to view the hosted documentation, we only need to add /swagger at the end of that URL. Now we can see the hosted documentation on Swagger UI. This is a convenient way of distributing documentation for our API to teams that will be using it. The Linx server will monitor the amount of times that our API is called and also pick up any errors. Let's test our hosted API with Postman. To call our new hosted API with Postman, we need to set the base URI variable to match that of our Linx server. To do this, go to Collections, click on Products API, then under the Variables tab, you'll see there's a base URI variable. Change the current variable to match that of our API. Now we can call our API from Postman. I'm going to call the product by ID method a few times. One time deliberately with an incorrect value to see what happens in the Linx server once an error occurs. In the Linx server, on the Solutions dashboard, we can see the amount of times that the API was called. Note here that successful executions are marked in green and any errors are marked in red. To see what specific error occurred, we can click on the red area and then view the error. You can also view errors or any specific logging on the log section, where there will be more detail available. And we have now successfully created, hosted, and tested an API. Thank you for watching this video on creating an API with Linx and Postman. For more information, visit linx.software.